All right, YouTube homeowners and swimming pool owners, I'm going to show you today how to rebuild a Polaris booster pump for a PB4-60 Polaris pump motor. How to rebuild it by changing out the bearings when the bearings go bad. This is a brand new pump and it's got cheap Chinese bearings. So I'm going to use this opportunity to make the video and change out the bearings for some high-end, expensive German bearings. These are NSK. They might be Japanese. I think that, yeah, Japanese. But anyway, these NSK bearings are much higher quality than the cheap generic Chinese bearings that they put in these Chinese motors. So it's a brand new motor. And a good reason to do this is two things. One, you can change out the cheap bearings to good high quality bearings that are going to last a lot longer. But the other thing is, and a very important thing, by taking this apart and putting it back together, you can lubricate every fastener on this motor with some anti-seize compound. You don't have to use that brand, just use any brand of anti-seize. And lubricate all the threaded fasteners. Put lubricant underneath the heads when you put this all back together. That way later when you have to rebuild it again, in particular these 4 long through bolts won't be seized up, because from what I understand it's not uncommon for these long through bolts to be so corroded in the future. When you try to tear this thing down, you can't do it because you break those bolts. And then you got to deal with extracting broken bolts. So if you're going to install a new pump motor, you might as well take advantage of this time to prep it for future rebuild. Now you can look in other videos on YouTube to find out how to take the pump off. I'm not going to go over that. You don't even have to have a video. You can easily see how to do that. But anyway, once you get your pump off, you want to go ahead and rebuild the motor. So you loosen up these 4 long through bolts with a, let's see, is that an 8 or a 9 millimeter socket? That's an 8 millimeter socket. So loosen those up. Take this end cap off. Just loosen it up with an appropriate wrench and then pop it off. It's got 2 tabs that fit into these 2 slots. That's going to allow you to grab the motor shaft. Actually, you do that when you take the pump off. The reason you open that up and expose that so you can put a wrench on there, hold that shaft, and get the impeller off the pump. So when you go to rebuild your bearings, you will have already taken that off. Now before you take this motor apart, it's important that you mark the alignment between this cap and this case. I don't know if you can see it, but I put a yellow mark there with a yellow marker because it shows up on black. And that way when I put it back together, I can get this end cap lined up with this body so that these through bolts will find their threaded bosses down at the other end. So put a mark across this case and this end cap. You can use a marker. You could hit it with a chisel or put 2 dimples with a center punch. There's different ways to do it, but just make sure that you have a method of realigning this end case with this case. Now here's another part of the real value of rebuilding this brand new motor before you ever even put it in service. This screw here holds a bearing retainer inside of this end piece. And if you have a really old pump that's been in service a long time, that screw can be completely corroded. And in fact, I took one of these pumps apart, got it completely dismantled, got to this point, and could not get that bolt out. And I had to drill it out. And after I drilled it out, I almost broke an easy out trying to back it out, and that didn't work. So I drilled it completely out, and the bearing retainer was still stuck in there, frozen on the bearing race, and I could not get the pump apart, so I had to throw it away after all that work I put into it. So by doing this, before you ever put the motor in service, you take that apart and you're going to lubricate that when you reassemble this. Then in the future, when you tear this motor apart again, that fastener is going to be lubricated. And I wouldn't just put anti-seize on the threads, I would put anti-seize underneath the head of that screw, so the screw head isn't corroded to the body. All right, so I've loosened that screw. I've loosened up the through bolts. Now I should be able to tap this end piece off of the motor. Tap it off with a hammer and some kind of screwdriver or chisel or something. There's actually some little slots in here that you can put a screwdriver in. There's one here and one on the other side. You can just tap it off. I'm probably not going to show that on camera, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it. All right, so I tapped in there with a hammer and a screwdriver. There's a slot here which you can't see. There's another slot there. I just tapped in the slot, got it loose, and that cap should just come right on off. I'll keep working it off and then I'll show you. Okay, so I worked the end cap off, and that exposes the rotor in there and the bearing that I'm going to change out. Even though that's a brand new bearing, I have had reports that they fail very quickly, so I'm just going to get rid of it and change it out for that nice, expensive Japanese bearing. These are NSK 6203 VV. They're double sealed. They don't have a metal shield, they've got a rubber seal on both sides. So that's the bearing I'm going to use. I got these for about $19 each on Amazon, whereas these cheap original Chinese bearings cost between $8 to $10. So these are twice the price. But for 40 bucks for a fresh set of bearings to get a longer service life and not have to do this rebuild very often, I'm perfectly happy to do that. I should be able to pull the rotor out. I undid the bearing retainer on the other side that I showed you before. Let's see if this rotor is going to come out. I need to rotate the bearing lock out of position. I'll do that off camera and then come back. Actually, you've got to remove this back case also. So I put another yellow hash mark there across, and I'll take that back case off. I just tapped it off with the hammer and screwdriver just like I did the front case. So now I've got the rotor out, and I can change that bearing. And there's a bearing in here. I can pull this off and change out that bearing. The bearing's sitting in a bearing boss in this end cap. Okay, so I've got my bearing puller installed on that bearing. I'm going to pull it off. I'll show you when I get finished. Okay, so I actually took that rotor inside and chucked it up in the vise. Grabbed the body of it in the vise so I could get the bearing puller on there and pull the bearing off. It was easier than try to do it out here freehand wobbling around on the table. But this bearing's off. This whole case pulls off the other end. I'm going to take that and chuck it in the vise and pull that off with the bearing puller also. Alright, so here's the rotor chucked in the vise with the bearing puller fastened to this cap. You can see the bearing there. And I'll just pull that off. So I got this end cap loose. I pulled it off the bearing. I'll set that aside, and then I'll go ahead and pull that bearing off with the bearing puller. And then I can drive the new bearings on. Alright, so I pulled that bearing off with the bearing puller. That's the mounting boss right there. When you drive the new bearing on, there's a shoulder right here that'll stop the new bearing. And I'm sure you know, whenever you drive a bearing on, you want to put your bearing drift on the inner race, not the outer race of the bearing. You don't want to pound on the outer race of your bearing. You want to apply your force to the inner race. So I'll install the new bearings. So I'm going to drive this new bearing onto the shaft. I've got a piece of pipe here that'll bear on the inner race only. And I'll just tap that with a hammer gently until I get the race, the bearing seated up against that shoulder. It'll push right up and it'll stop right on that shoulder right there. Alright, so I found a piece of pipe that was the right diameter to slip right on there and bear right up against that inner race. And once I got the right pipe, it was just snapped to drive that bearing right up against the mounting boss back there. So that bearing's changed out. Okay, so here's the new bearing for the other end. The NSK 6203 VV. Interestingly, the bearing I pulled off, the two bearings I pulled off of here, also have NSK imprinted on them. They say NSK China. These new bearings don't have any indication on them where they're made. So I sure as hell hope I paid for some good non-Chinese bearings. Anyway, I'll go ahead and drive that on. That doesn't have very far to go. So I'll probably just pop that thing on with a socket, or I might use that same pipe that I used on the other bearing. Okay, I drove that on with a socket. And remember, when you're driving on bearings, if you're undertaking this project, you've probably done this before, but if not, you need to understand, when you push a bearing onto a shaft, don't push on the outer race of the bearing. Push on the inner race. If you push on the outer race, all the force that you're pushing has to transfer from the race through the cage and the balls to the inner race, and it can deform and damage that cage that holds those balls. So if you've never changed a bearing, when you pull them off, it doesn't matter how you pull them off because you're going to throw them away. You can pull on the outer race or the inner race. But when you push a bearing on a shaft, push on the inner race only. Now I'll go ahead and reinstall the rotor back into the motor. All right, let's check out something here for a minute. That thing right there locks onto the outer race of the bearing after you install this. So you've got to swing it out of the way, install this cap on the rotor, or install the rotor in the cap, however you want to look at it. Then you can swing that thing back up, and then you secure it with that screw. And you want to lubricate that screw real good so that in the future, when you have to take it off again, you can do it. And you can actually look through these vents once you've got the rotor installed in there to see the positioning of that little plate, and make sure you can see that you flipped it back over the bearing race and it's not hanging back like this, but it's flipped up like that. You can look through the vents and see yourself position it properly, and then tighten the screw. So that was a slip fit. It just slipped right in there. I didn't have to bang it or drive it. The bearing just dropped right into the boss. And then I'll flip that plate over that holds onto the outer race of the bearing, and I'll secure that with that screw. But before I do that, I'm going to lubricate the hell out of those threads and the back side of this plate and the back side of that screw with anti-seize compound. All right, so I disassembled this screw from this retainer plate, glommed this all up with anti-seize and the threads, the back surface of this plate, the under surface of this screw. They're all glommed up with anti-seize so that in the future I can get this thing apart if I need to. Okay, now these are the bosses for the long through bolt that holds the whole thing together. And I'm going to lubricate these threads and those holes and the undersides of these bolt heads with anti-seize compound so that if I have to disassemble this in future, it'll be a lot easier and I won't snap these off and break them. Now I went ahead and put anti-seize compound in the holes because when I put this together and I put anti-seize on the threads and push it through, I assume most of that anti-seize will stay on there, but in case I lose any of it on the passageway through, I've got each one of these holes glommed up full of anti-seize compound. Actually, I did my assembly out of order there. I've got to put the rotor through the case before I put the end case on. Now I can go ahead and put the end cap back on there. Okay, I had that all back asswards. This part of the shaft goes that way, and this part goes this way. So I need to assemble this together and then push it on through. I'll get it right here sooner or later. All right, I got the thing assembled correctly. You probably can't see it, but the bearing retainer in there, I flipped it so that it's holding the outer race of the bearing and then tighten the screw. If you can't see it on my video, you'll be able to see it when you do it. Now I'll reassemble that. Now when I took this apart, you remember I had to put a mark on the case and the end cap. There's a little yellow mark there. I need to get those lined up. I've got that mark I made perfectly lined up. So now when I line up this cap with this case, the through bolts will go where they're supposed to go. All right, so I've got this end cap loosely in place. I just gently set it on there. And I'll line up my marks that I made. They're over here, you can't see them. But I'll get my marks lined up and then tap that into position. This little workbench is handy because it's got a bunch of holes drilled in it. So I just set the motor up vertical, put the shaft through the hole in the table. Now you can see I can line up my marks and then tap that into position and secure it. All right, there it is, perfectly lined up. All I need to do to button this up is put my 4 through bolts, and I've changed out the bearings on a brand new motor for what I hope are better bearings. I'm lubing up the threads and the undersides of the bolt heads with anti-seize for easier disassembly in the future. Now I'm going to tighten these through bolts kind of alternately, just like you would do a cylinder head or a car tire. Go here, 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 here. You know, tighten them alternating to pull that case together evenly. All right, so I've got all these torqued down. Don't over torque them. Just get them snug. But what you might want to do is after you've run your pump for a while, go out there and check them. see if they've loosened up a little bit after you've had the pump in operation for a short while. Just give them a little check and see if they need a little snugging. Okay, so that's it. I got the motor reassembled with fresh bearings. It was really quick and easy. You just need to have a bearing puller to pull the bearings and the right size pipe to slide over the shaft to bang the bearings into place. That's a 17 millimeter shaft. You can do the math or look at a table to figure out what that is in inches and make sure you get the right size pipe that will bear right on the inner race of the bearing when you're tapping it onto the shaft. So that says NSK, but it also says China. So I'm just going to pitch those bearings. I'll go ahead and put the water slinger back on. And I've got the impeller and volute assembly over there and a rebuild kit, so I'm going to rebuild all that and put it back on the motor. You can see all that easily on other YouTube videos, but I don't think I ever saw a video showing replacement of the bearings on the booster pump. There are videos that show how to replace the bearings on the regular pumps, and it's pretty much the same, really. But if you wanted to see a specific booster pump bearing replacement, this was it. And oh, by the way, when you reassemble the pump with all the bolts that bolt it together and the bolts that bolt it to the motor, anti-seize, use it. You don't have to get that brand, but you can use any anti-seize you like. But put it on all the threaded fasteners when you reassemble your pump to your motor.